I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, we have a special guest on the podcast. Please welcome Professor Frederik Green. Professor Green, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And please just call me Frederik.
Okay. Really quickly, I just want to briefly summarize the author we're looking at before we get deep into the nitty-gritty. The author we're looking at is Xu Xu, and the book that Professor Green translated by Xu Xu is called Bird Talk and Other Stories by Xu Xu, Modern Tales of a Chinese Romantic, published by Stonebridge Press, an independent publisher based in California. We're looking at a writer who was quite famous from the 1930s on and who moved to Hong Kong in 1950 and lived the rest of his life pretty much outside of the PRC. Okay, now I've got to ask you, Fred, you are a graduate of Yale. Your advisor was Jing Tsu and Professor Charles Laughlin, right?
That's right. Yeah, I started out with Charles Laughlin, and then he went away, and Jing Tsu graciously took me under her wings.
You started this project while you were studying under Jing Tsu, is that correct?
No, I technically started it under Charles Laughlin. He taught us a class. He was working on his book on the Chinese essay, and he had us, and I took a class on Republican-era journals with him. And at Yale, we were in the fortunate position, the Yale Library is one of the oldest collections of dedicated collections of Chinese materials in the US, and they actually had print runs of all these Republican era journals because they subscribed to them back in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s when they first came out. And Charles Laughlin knew about that, and he sent us out into the stacks to find them and to work our way through and to find materials that we'd be interested in for our final papers. And that's how I came across Xu Xu. So I focused on the journals of the Lunyu Pai, Lin Yutang's group in Shanghai. And, there's the Lunyu Banyue Kan, the sort of the main journal of that group, the Renjian Shi. And Xu Xu sort of popped up in all of them, mostly as editor, but also increasingly as a contributor of poetry, of essays, and later on also of fiction. So that's sort of how I came across him.
I was wondering, so I have a PhD in Chinese, and I had never encountered Xu Xu in any of my readings. He was incredibly famous in the 1930s, 1940s. How long would you say that lasted?
So he was really, what you call probably an influential writer in the Chinese-speaking world until the 1960s, the late 1960s. He wrote, through the 1970s. However, in 1950, he left mainland China and became an exile in Hong Kong. And we can talk more about, the political circumstances that led to that. But that basically meant that he completely dropped off the radar of readers and anybody interested in literature in mainland China until his rediscovery in the 1980s. He continued to be widely read in Hong Kong and Taiwan by overseas Chinese communities in the United States. But obviously, his main readership in mainland China increasingly, like you, had no idea this person had existed.
Yeah. Is it fair to say he was censored in the PRC in the Maoist period?
Yeah. He, following 1950, none of his books were published. He was basically expurged from the literary canon. What is interesting is that he was sometimes used, or his fiction was sometimes used as, an example, the epitome of bourgeois literature, anti-revolution, counter-revolutionary literature that needed to be There's a great quote from a literary critic: "Thrown into the cesspool." If anybody had kept a copy of it stacked away. So that's, in a way, interestingly, how he lived on. As late as the 1980s, there is film adaptation of a novel by Wang Mang, and sort of there's a character who reads one of Xu books, Ghost Love, one of the stories that I actually translated. And the protagonist is precisely that. Is somebody who is completely, these counter-revolutionary tendencies and bourgeois ideas, and no hope for ever reaching political, enlightenment. So yeah.
So this is a collection of, I think, 5 short stories. There is Ghost Love, Bird Talk, 100 Souls Tree?
The All Souls Trees, yeah.
The All Souls Tree, The Jewish Comet, and what's the final story?
It's a short story called When Ahern Came to Gosing Road, like 高盛路的一个女人.
Very few people, I'm guessing, who are listening to this podcast have heard of Xu. If I haven't heard of him, could you just kind of, you've talked a little bit, he left China, the mainland China, when the PRC was founded. Could you talk a little bit about who Xu is and give us a little bit of a sense of his biography? Who are we dealing with? What kind of an author are we looking at?
Okay, yeah. So Xu, I would say that, of course, because I've spent so much time with him. But he's an incredibly interesting author. He's interesting, for one, because his work, his oeuvre, really spans this very interesting period in modern Chinese literary history. He came onto the literary scene in the 1930s in Shanghai. He was very, very widely read throughout the 30s and 40s. When war broke out, he eventually went to Chongqing. He published some of his best-known works in Chongqing. He returned to Shanghai after the war briefly, until 1950, when he decided to leave for Hong Kong. He was born in 1908 and lived to 1980. So he, again, kind of spans that entire long 20th century, in Chinese history. He's originally from Zhejiang. He studied philosophy at Peking University from 1927 to 1932. And like so many other Chinese intellectuals of that generation, he was very much steeped in traditional learning. Family members had served in the civil service, so he was steeped in traditional learning. But of course, he was also exposed to Western ideas. And when he studied philosophy at Peking University, he was particularly interested in Western philosophy. He was very much interested in a philosopher called Henri Bergson, who in the 1920s, a French philosopher who was very much en vogue, including in China. But then in 1932, he moves to Shanghai because he wanted to be a writer. And Shanghai, of course, in the 1920s and the 1930s was the publishing hub in China. And he came under the auspices of Lin Yutang, a very well-known polyglot intellectual writer and publisher of a number of very successful literary and cultural journals, like the Lun Yu Banyue and the Analects Monthly. He became the editor, and he increasingly also contributed his own work. So he wrote poetry. He wrote poetry his entire life. He has multiple works of poetry. I think he probably even wrote more poetry than he wrote fiction. But so he also wrote essays. That was something that Lin Yutang promoted heavily at that time, a very popular genre, and increasingly fiction. And what is sort of interesting about him is, I'm sure you've read a lot of Republican era fiction, and your listeners, you're familiar of, Lu Xun, you're familiar of the sort of socialist realist or social realist fiction of, people like Ba Jin, and a lot of that is very grim. We think of the literature of the 1920s as kind of being very much in tune with the social challenges China is facing. And Xu Xu was somebody who from early on embraced this exoticism. Protagonists travel to these distant places and they meet these exotic women. And, when I first encountered him, I was immediately drawn to these stories that were so different from anything else I had read from the period. And I think that's really, that is sort of what put him on the literary scene. These exotic tales of faraway places. He wrote these quasi-ghost stories. And that's sort of what started, I think that's, he started out as a writer of that kind of fiction.
So you mentioned exoticism. Can I ask, the Jewish Comet and both and also Ghost Story is concerned with, he seems to be very interested in the question of Jews and Jewishness. At the very least, it plays an important role in those two stories. Ghost Story, the ghost being a Hebrew-speaking, half Jew, half Huaqiao, Chinese, I guess I don't think she would be described as a protagonist character. And then the Jewish Comet also has a quite prominent role for Jew. Is he particularly interested in Jews? Is his interest in Jews unique in China in the 1930s? I mean, I'm just thinking of this fascinating period. It's the 1930s. We know what's coming. He doesn't. But in terms of the question of Jewish identity, I think it's a very interesting period. I think the Jewish Comet is also interesting because you have this Italian fascist playing this role in the story. I don't know if that was a cogent question or not.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And this could be a very long answer because I think there are multiple parts to it. So there was actually a lot of interest among intellectuals in the struggle of the Jews for a homeland. You mentioned one of my former advisors, Jingzu. She talked about that in her first book, Failure, Nationalism, and Literature. How a lot of Chinese who sort of saw imperialism as a threat to nationhood, and who kind of had this deep pessimism for traditional Chinese culture, they kind of sympathized with with Jews, and there was really an interest in that. In the 1930s, as there was an increase of anti-Semitism in Europe, that interest, I think, became even more intense. And several, actually, of the journals, I mentioned Lin Yutang's journals, frequently carried articles on Judaism, on the Jews, on the Jewish condition in Europe and Palestine. And that is really interesting. However, in fiction, I think we find that there's very little reference to Jews or Judaism, and Xu Xu in that way really, I think, is an exception. One of the very few writers, and there are multiple stories where we have Jewish characters or half Jewish characters. As you mentioned in Ghost Love, we have that female. I think we can call her a protagonist, a female protagonist, right? She's half Jewish, half Chinese. And then, of course, we have that story, The Jewish Comet. And I said earlier, the question could be very complex because I think, the Jewish Comet and the reason why he chose to have a Jewish protagonist here is more complex. So there is that interest, I think, among people like Xu Xu, intellectuals, writers like Xu Xu, who have that, who do have an existing interest in Judaism or, the struggle of the Jews. But he, of course, was in Shanghai. And Shanghai in the 1930s did have a noticeable presence of Jews. And that history actually goes back to the beginnings of the foreign concession in Shanghai. So, just after the Opium Wars, when you had British merchants arrive, after the Opium Wars, one of the clauses of the Treaty of Nanjing was that China had to open up a number of its ports to foreigners, and they would get extraterritorial rights there. And Shanghai, of course, became the most important of these ports, and we have these foreign concessions. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard about them. So we had the Anglo-American International Settlement, and we had the French concession. So among some of the earliest arrivals with the British were Baghdadi Jews who had left, Baghdad in, I think, the 17th, 18th century, and had come to India and had served the Moguls and later the British, and had become, very wealthy merchants, intermediaries, and some of them came to Shanghai. So there's one family in particular, the Sassoons. There's actually currently an exhibition in New York on them. And so they came to Shanghai and played a very important role in the real estate business. So you had Jews living in the foreign concessions from the very beginning of the foreign concessions. But then in the 1920s, after the Russian Revolution, you had an influx of Jews from Russia come to Shanghai. So there were not just Shanghai, there were a couple of other places, Harbin too. And they were sort of the second wave. And then in the 1930s, you had Central European Jews, German Jews, who were escaping, Europe, Germany, as anti-Semitism under the Nazis became more intense. And the reason they came to Shanghai was because Shanghai, for a period of time in the 1930s, was one of the only places in the world where you did not need a visa. So as long as you could get a steamer ticket to Shanghai and you had a valid passport to de-embark, you could just be there. And in that period, I think up to, I'm not sure when that window closed, probably 36 or 38, by some estimates, as many as 18,000 Jews arrived in Shanghai, either by steamer, by mostly Italian steamships from Trieste. There was a regular weekly liner service from Italy to Shanghai, or by land through the Soviet Union, by train, essentially. But that journey was a lot more arduous because you needed a lot more transit visas. You needed across the Soviet Union. So that was more difficult. But there were some, especially from Lithuania, who went that route, but the majority came by ship. So, I'm actually always surprised that there isn't more literature that commented on the presence, right? That must have been quite visible, quite noticeable, right? There were Jewish shop owners, there were Jewish cafes, restaurants, there was a Jewish, newspaper in Shanghai. So, that presence was must have been quite noticeable. And so in a way, it's not surprising that Shushu would make that part of his story, but it's definitely the exception, right? As far as I know, I haven't come across any other pieces of fiction that really explore, that connection with Jews in Shanghai. And in the story, you mentioned the story, there's of course a real sort of meeting taking place, right? The protagonist first meets this Jewish shop owner, and then of course he meets that mysterious woman.
In this story, there is as in many Shushu stories, the Jewish comet has a kind of modern, intellectual Chinese narrator who meets this Jewish shop owner. He befriends him. This Jewish shop owner introduces him to this mysterious woman who supposedly has an inheritance, right? That's waiting for her in Europe if she comes back to Europe married. And then, and I don't want to ruin it, so I'm not going to say any more, but this actually turns out to be a spy story. and there are lots of twists and turns. One thing I noticed about Shushu's work is that it felt like you had to dedicate a little bit more to it than I think, at least than I expected. So I would frequently find myself in stories like The Jewish Comet, or I think my favorite story was The All Souls Tree. And a similar thing happened. I would read and I wasn't seeing where this story was going. And then about 2/3 of the way in, it kind of all clicked into place and I had to actually go back and reread the story. That's true, I think, of The Jewish Comet, where, tell me if I'm wrong, Shushu is kind of misdirecting us in terms of the narrative. It totally does not appear to be a spy story at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Is that something that you saw throughout Shushu's collected works?
I think Shushu really is a storyteller. He always likes to tell stories. And, all of his fiction is very much plot driven. And I think, that is something that really attracted me to him. A lot of these stories are just, they're just fun. They're fun, they're interesting. There often is a twist. You mentioned that, and sometimes you need to go back and you're like, what? And you need to reread part of them. But that is definitely something that I think we find in a lot of his works. He has a lot of these, especially early on, quasi ghost stories. Usually they actually turn out not to be really ghost stories, because I think he was, he was especially when he was young, he was he was a modern. He was, he deep down he did no longer believe in ghosts, but he was drawn to something that might defy science, right? He was modern on the one hand, but at the same time, I think he did see himself maybe in contrast or in opposition maybe to realism and an ultimate belief in science. And this is something that I kind of define as his romanticism, that he was kind of more drawn to that. But that twist in the stories, that is something that we always see. You mentioned that this turns out or develops into a spy story, and again, I think this is very much something that that places Shushu in that particular moment in time in Chinese history and Chinese literary history. So in the 1930s, spy fiction, and actually not just in China, all over the world, was very popular, right? There, and interestingly, usually female spies. So Shushu's most famous, and probably the work that that he's best remembered for, and that most people might know him for, is a work called Feng Xiao Xiao, The Rustling Wind, and that is a spy story. It's a spy story set during the Japanese occupation of Shanghai, and actually quite as with so many of Shushu's works, we have a Chinese male narrator, and he has these relations with these mysterious women, some of whom are not even Chinese. Some are Chinese, some are of mixed race, some are foreign. So there was a real fascination with that. And again, I think that is a reflection of the very cosmopolitan nature of pre-war Shanghai. Now, in The Jewish Comet, that sort of takes on another dimension, in that the female protagonist is actually Jewish. And we talked earlier about that interest that many intellectuals had in the Jews, the Jewish struggle. And then, of course, as the political situation in Europe becomes so intense, people were aware of the anti-Semitism and the threats to Jews. When you look at these journals, especially the journals that Lin Yutang published, there's another journal, Xifeng, The Western Wind, which was not so much a literary journal, it was really more a current affairs journal. It had tons of articles about this kind of question. So I think, educated cosmopolitan readers in Shanghai were interested in that, knew about that. So to have this situation fictionalized in a short story that is sort of, exotic, that has a gripping narrative, that has these twists and turns, I think, if you contextualize it in that period, is not surprising. However, if you pick it up now and you think of the kind of works that have been canonized, that have sort of become representative of Chinese literature, then it is highly unusual, because there aren't many.
We've talked a lot about the Jewish comet. Would you mind just reading a bit?
Absolutely, yeah. I'll, with a lot of his short stories, the opening is really great, because it sort of sets up this mystery. So let me just read the opening of the Jewish comet. When I awoke, all I could see through the pothole was the open sea. I immediately thought of her. Had she gotten sick? Had this big plan been abandoned after all? Yet when I got out of my bunk to have a cigarette, I saw 2 unfamiliar pieces of luggage. When I also noticed some items of makeup and some toiletries next to the wash basin, I knew that she must have come on board after all. Still, I was not entirely sure yet, because when I had gone to bed, it was 3 in the morning. The ship had been scheduled to sail at 4. Could she really have embarked that late? I wanted to find out, and slipped into my shoes. The lower bunk was empty, but the blanket was tousled. She must have already gotten up. Yes, indeed, she must have already gotten up, because her toiletries were wet. In addition, I spotted 2 brown strands of hair in the wash basin. I could not remember whether her hair had been brown or black or blonde, but these strands surely must have been hers. It was already 10. I hurriedly washed and went to the dining room to have breakfast. She probably had already finished hers and stepped out on deck, I thought. There were still a few scattered passengers in the dining room. Even before I could step inside and see if maybe she was still there, I noticed a woman dressed in blue and gray, waving at me from a table on the left. I had no idea whether it was her or not, but since it was a European-looking woman who was waving at me, it had to be her. When I walked over to her, she took hold of my hand, giving the semblance of intimacy and familiarity. I sat down across from her. She asked me if I had slept well the previous night and what time I had boarded the ship, as well as a whole lot of other questions. I'm usually not much of a conversationalist, and all I could do as she was quizzing me over breakfast was reply to her questions, even if I had wanted to ask something in return. Only when she had finished breakfast and taken out a cigarette did I finally have a chance. I took out a match and, lighting her cigarette for her, asked, "It must have been close to 4 when you came on board." "Yes," she said, hastily exhaling her first drag of smoke. "I thought it might bother you if I came on board any earlier. When someone from China sails to Europe, it's just like when we Europeans travel to China. It's such a long journey, and there surely were a lot of relatives and friends who came to see you off. Wouldn't it have raised eyebrows if they had seen you depart with a foreign woman?" "Miss, but I thought—" "Now don't call me that. We're already husband and wife. Husband and wife should not address each other in that way, according to neither Chinese nor Western customs. Isn't that right? You had best address me by my first name. I'm called Catherine." I blushed a little. I, a 30-plus-year-old divorced father of a daughter and son, made to blush by a 20-something-year-old woman. I began to have regrets. Regretted that I had agreed to her becoming my wife. How had all this come about? It had begun 3 months earlier. After the Ministry of Education announced that it would send me to Europe to study vocational education, I made my way to Shanghai to prepare for my stay abroad. I had never had the habit of wearing Western-style clothes, and so I had to purchase an entire wardrobe, from necktie to dress shirt. I found a shop on Avenue Joffre in the French concession of Shanghai that was comparatively inexpensive. The store was tiny, and its owner was accountant, sales clerk, and assistant all in one. My several purchases at the store had led me to become acquainted with the owner, who was named Shackles. He told me that he was Norwegian and that he was Jewish. He was short and plump, had a moustache, and was in his 40s. He told me that he had gotten around quite a bit, and that he spoke several languages. My first destination was going to be France. and because my French was pretty rusty, I took the opportunity to practice with him whenever he was not too busy. With his store. He usually wasn't. Business was slow, probably because it was the middle of the summer. I would buy a few things and then chat with him for an hour or two. So let's leave it at that.
So we have this opening. There's the clear implication that there's something untoward's going on, but it's a misdirection. It's not at all what you think, or at least what I thought when I first read this story. There's something else going on. There's a mystery, and he doesn't really answer it until much later. What happened? I mean, he tells the story that you were just getting into. It does kind of have the feel, the sense of mystery of a spy novel, but at first I didn't think it was a spy novel.
Yeah, it takes a while, right? It takes a while for that spy element to really come through. Actually, we kind of have to wait almost to the very end. And what he kind of makes us believe at first, of course, is that it's this love story, right? This kind of somewhat, which of course also is rather unusual, a rather unusual love story. And sort of in the middle of the story, there's this sort of quasi-philosophizing about love and the meaning of love and the difference, of course, between love, the way the Chinese might define it, and love how Westerners might define it. And that actually, I think, is what most readers sort of would have expected from a story by Xu Xu, because a lot of that early work from the 1930s and 1940s often delves into that East-West dialogue. And that, I think, again, is very much indicative of, the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Shanghai. So a lot of the works that came out of those journals that Lin Yutang was, that had established, whether it's Lun Yu Ban Yu Kan, whether it's Xi Feng, the Western Wind, Ren Jian Shi, a lot of those were very much interested in East-West encounters. And Lin Yutang himself, of course, saw himself as that mediator between the West and Chinese culture. And Xu Xu himself, he wrote a lot of essays that questioned or that focused on differences between East and West, whether it's aesthetics, whether it's philosophy, whether it's love. So in several of those exotic stories, they are love stories, but we often do have sort of a subplot almost, where he sort of tries to explore cultural differences, stereotypes. And we kind of have that also in this story. But then, of course, as you pointed out, there is that twist in this story. And the story really kind of connects to the political situation in Europe in the late 1930s. I should have said earlier that Xu Xu in 1936 himself actually traveled to Europe. He traveled on that steamer. He traveled on board that Italian liner of the Lloyd Triestino, right? That regular steamer service between Shanghai and Italy that actually features in this book, and that played an important role in history later on. We kind of already touched upon the fact that many thousand Jews managed to leave Europe for Shanghai. And it's kind of important that they took that Italian liner because it was relatively easy. I say relatively because it wasn't that easy to start with, to leave Germany for Italy, because Italy, of course, was an Axis power of the Nazis, right? There were other steamer services, from England, from other places, but it would have been, near to impossible, because obviously you needed an exit visa. But apparently, for a short moment of time, it was relatively easy to get to Italy. I actually, this is a tangent, and it's a tangent you might want to cut out, I don't know. But I actually, a few years ago, I met a Jewish survivor who had done exactly that. He was, his family had owned a number of pharmacies in Berlin, and his father had been rounded up, after during the Reichskristallnacht. And he was imprisoned for several months, and his mother had seen the writing on the wall, had sold their entire properties, and when the father came back home, she said, okay, we're going to Shanghai. And the father and the son was the survivor I met, went to Italy, managed to purchase steamer tickets, and then went to Shanghai, and he survived. The family survived the war there, and he eventually ended up in America. He ended up in Minnesota, and that's where I happened to interview him, and I brought him to class. And that was even, interestingly, that was before. Sadly, that was before I had translated the story, the Jewish Comet, because I would have loved to show him the story and ask him what he thought about it. Unfortunately, he passed away in the meantime. Yes, the story then in really interesting ways, I think, feeds into the interest of cosmopolitan readers in Shanghai, in that it is about East-West encounters. It's about sort of this East-West love affair, but at the same time, it taps into the political situation. And so I said Xu traveled to Shanghai, traveled to Europe in 1936. He was going to spend time in Paris studying abroad, probably for a few years, but that was cut short once the war broke out, and he rushed back in early 1938. But so he wrote the story while he was in Paris in 1937. He had been on that steamer for a month. He probably had met some foreigners. I don't know. I mean, of course, so much of this, is fictionalized. He's fictionalizing the situation. But at the same time, as with so many of his stories, there is a little bit of his own biography feeding into the story. You mentioned earlier that we always have these first-person male narrators, these sort of very cosmopolitan. They often speak foreign languages. The narrator, right? He tells us himself he speaks French. And they're actually usually called Xu, and it's often even the same character. So he creates this, this fictional character who quite deliberately shares much of the biography of the writer himself, and that is something we see in almost all of his fiction. Now, what is interesting is that the narrator, or the character, I think, of the narrator changes after he leaves mainland China and he goes to Hong Kong. And we have this shift from this very confident, cosmopolitan, young man who has these romances with often Western women, to one who becomes more reticent, who is an exile himself, an exile now in Hong Kong, who's maybe more an observer, and a lot of his work becomes much less cosmopolitan, and more focused on China, the Chinese condition. Often there's flashbacks. It's we return to pre-war Shanghai, or we return to pre-war Republican era China. So we still have that first-person narrator. We still have a first-person narrator who's often called Xu. So we still share that those similar traits, but the narrator clearly changes.
That's a great point to segue into the All Souls tree, actually, which I think was my favorite story. If I could just sum it up. So this story is published in Hong Kong in 1950. There's a narrator who's visiting Taiwan. Mainland China and Taiwan are separated by this point. They go to Alishan. He has this previous relationship with this female character who's considered kind of, I think it's fair to say that the other characters consider her strange. Is that fair?
Yeah, a little introvert, and yeah.
And he has this encounter with her. There is this question of ghost, of love. I don't want to spoil it, but I thought this story was incredibly haunting, but it's another example of one of those things where I got 2/3 through the story and I had to go back and completely reread it. The narrative had misdirected my attention, and it seems like a story about ghost, and maybe it is, but it's also this very kind of interesting question about love and ghost. And it's very hard to describe. It's not a ghost story in that kind of genre question. It's not a love story, but it's sort of both.
Yeah, So, it's also one of my favorite stories. Actually, I shouldn't say that, because I kind of in strange ways I like all of them. But one of the reasons I picked this story is because, again, in many ways, it's very, very representative of Shushu's fiction, in that, as rightly pointed out, it makes us wonder, is this a ghost story? And he sort of wants us to believe that it is a ghost story. And we have a lot of stories like that. At the same time, like the Jewish comet, it's also a story that's very much grounded in that historical moment in Chinese history. The narrator is in Taiwan, and it's 1950, and we're right at the end of the Civil War, right? And the protagonist, that girl, she came to Taiwan probably already a little early on. She works for a bank. She came probably in 1947, 1948. And of course, Chiang Kai-shek's government at that time already started to move some of that important infrastructure, including banks, from China to Taiwan. So all of that, to completely, I think, would have made sense to readers, in the 1950s, who were familiar with the political situation. Now, her lover, of course, remains in mainland China, and they're separated. They're separated by civil war. And of course, at that time, I'm sure people were still hopeful that this division would be overcome. But so they're separated. And yes, again, it's a love story. She ends up telling us her love story, and that becomes part of the narrative, right? But then there is that ghost story element. The title of the story, of course, is the All Souls Tree, and that is the name of a tree that they sort of see on Alishan, or they pick some of the leaves, and we are told at some point that some people think that this tree has the ability to convey omens, right? That it can speak to you, and right, it happens to be this really stormy night, and this girl thinks that the trees communicate a message to her, and until the very end. I don't want to spoil the end for the readers, because the end is quite gripping. Yeah, it's and of course, we don't know. We don't know whether it was an omen. We don't know whether the tree really did speak to her. But of course, it also doesn't matter, right? Because she thought it did, and I think that's precisely also Shushu's take on ghosts or supernatural, encounters. As long as you, as an individual, think they existed, then they exist. As long as you think you experienced it, then you experienced it, and they have relevance. So I said earlier that Shushu was through and through a modern, a modern Chinese intellectual, and I'm sure he didn't believe in ghosts. Well, I what do I know? But so there are very few stories that are ghost stories in the traditional sense, where narrator starts out and says, okay, here's a ghost, and we as readers have to take his or her word for that. No, he gives us these situations or these encounters where, if you choose to believe in ghosts or supernatural beings or encounters, you can do that, but you don't have to. Interestingly, there is really only one or two stories that are really ghost stories, and actually there's one that he wrote. I think it's one of the very last works of fiction that he wrote, shortly before he passed away, that really would count as a ghost story, and that I find quite intriguing, actually. So most of them, they're modern ghost stories, in that maybe they are, maybe they're not. And I think this is also very much a reflection of Shushu's relationship to religion. So Shushu was incredibly interested in religion, but interested, I think, on a philosophical level. So we already talked about the presence of Jews and Judaism in his story. A lot of the stories actually really, explore religious questions and engage with different religions. So there's another story, I didn't translate it, I talk about it in the afterword of the book. It's called Bi'an, The Other Shore. And it's really through and through a fictional tale. It's a story about love. Love and responsibility, but the narrator asks all these questions framed in a religious or quasi-religious, quasi-philosophical framework. And there's Buddhism and there's Christianity. He was equally interested in Christianity. A lot of his, characters, have follow the Christian faith. So, and I think it's the same motivation, right? The fact that religion can offer you solace in many ways, and whether or not you buy into everything that that religion wants you believe, that's up to you. You can pick and choose, take as much as you want. But so, and again, this is, I think, what I define in the afterword and instead of my more critical work on Xu as his romantic inclination, right? That he seeks he seeks solace in these things for his readers.
Can I ask, you mentioned that he is writing modern ghost stories, not kind of the traditional ghost story. At several points in your translation, he does reference Pu Songling, the famous ghost story writer. What is his relationship to the classical kind of ghost story that is so important to Chinese literature?
Yeah, another excellent question. So, again, I mentioned that he, like so many of his generation, were very much steeped in traditional learning, had been exposed to that as a child, and would have been intimately familiar with these works, right? Of the Qing or earlier works of ghost story. And yes, in a lot of his works, he actually does reference them. In Ghost Love, Gui Lian, right? He asks himself at some point, God, is this taken straight out of Pu Songling, right? Liao Zhai Zhi, is that, am I in the middle of one of these stories? He does the same in The All Souls Tree by Ling Shu. Interestingly, in that story, he also references other works. He references Hong Lao Meng, The Dream of the Red Chamber. So, he likes to do that. I think, again, it's something that a lot of his readers probably would have likewise appreciated because, like him, they would have been intimately familiar with these ghost stories. But again, right, they end up not being that traditional kind of ghost story. And there were people at the time who were writing ghost stories, right? It's not that the genre suddenly stopped once the Republic was declared. No, there was popular works that continued in that tradition, but no, he was clearly a modern intellectual who, to some degree, of course, also uses this questioning or these references to the ghost story to question their very existence, right? So I think that does make them more complex, and it shows that he had a larger aesthetic or literary agenda.
I think we should probably wrap it up now. This discussion, because I think Shushu is so interesting, has gone on longer than I normally let podcasts go on, but it was just kind of hard to stop. Do you have any final thoughts? Any questions where I missed and you're like, Lee, we should talk about this with Shushu?
No, as you said, this could go on and on. I never get tired of talking about him. And what I think is really interesting with Shushu is that, even though for me the defining characteristic or the sort of critical angle that I use to approach him is romanticism, it's very difficult to classify him because he wrote, he wrote so much. He had such a long literary career. He wrote in different genres. He wrote poetry. He wrote plays. And of course, so much fiction. What I did try in my translation you said it's a collection of 5 stories, and I try to pick 5 stories that are representative of the different stages in his literary career. So I mentioned he came onto the literary scene in the 1930s, in the mid-1930s in Shanghai, and Gui Lian, Ghost Love, is very much, a story of that period of Shanghai. We follow the protagonist on his nightly strolls through Shanghai, and he mentions all these landmarks. And that is very typical of modernist fiction from Shanghai from that period, where the city in itself becomes a protagonist. The Jewish Comet is really representative of wartime fiction. So much Chinese fiction, right? China itself, of course, enters that world war, right? There's the war against Japan, but of course China becomes an ally of America, and in a way, right, their Chinese are bestowed agency through Xu fiction, both in the Jewish Comet and then in that much longer work, The Rustling Wind. So I wanted to have a work that is representative of that wartime fiction, spy fiction. And then we have that shift after he leaves for Hong Kong, and we kind of have now, a lot of nostalgia. We have that in the title story, Bird Talk. We have it in the All Souls Tree that you mentioned is one of your favorite stories. But then later on, Hong Kong literature and Hong Kong readers and Hong Kong audiences also change. And I think in Hong Kong, in the 1950s, we have a lot of radio fiction that is specifically written to be performed on the radio. And then, of course, in the 50s and increasingly in the 1960s, we have cinema become the most important genre in Hong Kong, arguably replacing popular literature maybe as the main sort of entertainment or literary genre for popular entertainment. And Xu is actually really interested in cinema, and many of his works were turned into movies. For some of them he wrote the script, and I think he probably also wrote some fiction kind of probably with the cinema in mind. And the last story that I translated, When Ahern Came to Go Sing Road, I think is one of those works. It's far less philosophical than, say, the Bird Talk. It's a lot lighter in language and the story, and at the same time, it very much reflects, I think, the changes in society in Hong Kong. It talks about these immigrants. It talks about the way Hong Kong, is fast developing. Its economy, how people come to Hong Kong with this Hong Kong dream in mind. Through hard work, you can make it. It sort of tries to present his literary career in its entirety by picking 5 stories that I think are representative in different ways. I hope that some of your listeners might be interested in a writer who I think really is a fascinating writer in many ways, and through whose fiction I think we can really gain a very interesting glimpse of different periods in China's long 20th century that, of course, has seen so many ups and downs. Actually, let me say one last thing, which is kind of interesting. You kind of had earlier said that Xu to some degree is maybe a little bit of a forgotten reader, right? You hadn't heard of him. Many people hadn't heard of him. Many people in China haven't heard of him. So Xu was rediscovered really very much, in the 1980s, right? After the opening and reform in China. And, Lin Yutang was rediscovered at that time. And I think what so many Chinese intellectuals and just readers were drawn to after years, right, after decades of China being closed to the outside world, especially the Western world, was this cosmopolitanism, right, of Lin Yutang. Lin Yutang's cosmopolitanism and Xu Xu's cosmopolitanism and exoticism, right? That by reading these stories, you could travel to all of these different places, France and America. And so, there was a time when he was, in the 1980s, quite widely read. Almost all his pre-war work was reissued. A couple of movies were made based on these stories. And, I think the interest sort of has waned again because, there are other things in China. But what is interesting is that Xu Xu in Hong Kong had also pretty much been forgotten. So I said he was widely read until the late 60s. He later on became an academic. He taught at various colleges until he ended up as professor of Chinese at Baptist University in Hong Kong. He actually became the Dean of Humanities. And he played a very important role, I think, as a mentor to a newer generation of Hong Kong writers. He edited a number of journals in Hong Kong that became platforms for a younger generation of Hong Kong writers. However, many of those writers, or that new generation of Hong Kong writers and scholars, did not think of Xu Xu as a Hong Kong writer. So much of his work of the 1950s and 1960s was, of course, never about Hong Kong. It was about mainland China. It was about the Republican period. It was sort of, steeped in the aesthetics and the mindset of Republican era immigrants, many of whom never really made Hong Kong their home, never of whom really felt at home in Hong Kong, right? They were nostalgic for the mainland all their lives. And, and I think for that reason, a younger generation of Hong Kong writers and, of course, readers no longer felt connected to Xu Xu, right? He told stories that were not relevant to their lives. Their life and their reality was Hong Kong, and that was their city. And we have this newer generation, right? Writers like Xixi, Wocheng, My City, who make Hong Kong part of their stories, part of their identity. Liang Binjun, right? P.K. Leung, somebody else who is a Hong Kong writer, and for whom, Hong Kong, is all they know and all they love, and they love it, right? They love Hong Kong in a way that Xu Xu, I think, did not love Hong Kong. Yes, he made it his home, but that was, I think, more reluctantly. Now, what is really interesting is that over the last few years, Xu Xu is really being rediscovered in Hong Kong. Part of his, there is a new collection of his, an anthology, selected works of Xu Xu, part of the Hong Kong Writers series, came out in 2015. And I think what people suddenly realize, and this, of course, has a lot to do with the current political situation in Hong Kong, is that Xu Xu came to Hong Kong as an exile for political reasons. He left the mainland because he sensed that he could not have continued as a writer in mainland China. The way that his works had been attacked all throughout the 1940s by leftist intellectuals, he knew that there was no future for him. So I think now that Hong Kong is experiencing, these political changes firsthand, there is again a growing interest in Xu Xu, and a realization of just how important a voice he actually had been, and that is interesting. That is interesting, and I think makes his work even more relevant for us today. So maybe I should leave it at that.
I think that's a great place to end it. Xu Xu is a writer who is increasingly relevant, even though he was forgotten. He doesn't deserve to be. He deserves to be remembered. And if you want to remember him, I think the best way to do that is to take a look at this translation.
Thank you again for having me on your podcast. And thank you for all the great work that you do for making Chinese literature more relevant, and for opening up, readers for your audiences that they might not have known before. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Fred, Professor Green, thank you for coming on the podcast. This has been a fantastic conversation.